It was a cold, brisk Tuesday afternoon when my receptionist Chandra dropped a file on my desk. I didn't usually take cases from file, but this one caught my interest. The case asked one simple question. Did we destroy Lemanburg?
Come on, buddy, this is a Westy live video. You didn't seriously think I'd let you get 30 seconds in without plugging something, did you? Listen, if you enjoy Westy live content, then I'm telling you, following me on Twitch is one of the smartest decisions you're ever going to make. Now, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know a nerd who can tell you.
Well, let's say every video is about 15 minutes long. That means you can fit 4 videos into every hour. Given that Westy streams 4 times a week for 2 hours a stream, that's 8 hours of content a week. You get 32 times as much content on Twitch if Westy uploads a new video weekly.
32 times as much content is a lot of goddamn content. So if you want the most efficient way to consume Westy live content, I suggest you go to my Twitch right now and give us a follow. Enjoy the rest of this video.
Now, there are plenty of examples across the Dream SMP of us, the viewers, being canon elements of the Dream SMP lore. While there are certainly minor examples, such as Erits, Ferrets, or Ponk's Lemons, there are plenty of notable examples with more significance, like Philza's mysterious murder of crows. While writing the lore around the voices in my own lore-based SMP, I turned to these examples for inspiration, but came away with something more. A theory. I got to wondering how much influence these voices and particles could have on the actual story, and whether there was a canonical connection between the chat's every whim and the motivation of the characters themselves. Now, it's important that I make the distinction that I do not believe that Technoblade, for example, takes the whims of chat into account during canon moments. I'm well aware that most of it is scripted. What I'm trying to theorize, though, is that the canon appearances of chat could be the explanation behind certain story threads that lead to massive events, including the destructions of Lemanburg. Let's first start by analysing one of my personal favourite instances of canonical chats, Philza's murder of crows. From Philza's past discussions, he has made a few things clear that are pretty much consistent across the board. Firstly, only he can understand his crows, and so they cannot influence the actions of any other characters. This is consistent across the board, as without this kind of distinction, there would be no way to explain why other characters cannot hear the chat of the streamer. Philza, like most other creators on the Dream SMP, have been known to interact and even act on the wishes of the chat during canonical sequences. The best example I can think of is the interaction Phil had just before he joined the SMP, where the chat asked over and over for him to join in an attempt to stop Wilbur from blowing up Lemanburg, something which he acted upon, even if unsuccessfully.
What are you doing?
Phil?
What are you doing?
Phil, where are you?
I'm joining the server right now.
What? How?
I'm hacking in.
What do you mean you're hacking it? What?
And so now that we know that Philza is capable of hearing his chat during canonical moments, and even acting on their wishes, I want to apply that logic to Philza's very own son, Mr. Wilbur Soot. Now, we all know Wilbur's story, and if you don't, I would recommend watching my previous video on Wilbur's story so far. A young hopeful man comes to the Dream SMP with good intentions, and after many hardships and losses, ends up succumbing to a deteriorating mental state and destroying his very own nation. But one thing always bothered me about Wilbur's story. It always seemed odd to me that the bastion of freedom and the man that always thought 3 steps ahead both failed to see his own exile coming and toss aside his morals for a personal vendetta. The Wilbur we saw holding Chekhov's gun was a far cry than the one minutes before he lost his presidency. And while I don't think it's entirely impossible for things to go this way simply out of Wilbur's own volition, I think that it makes more sense that there was some form of external catalyst to his decline. I propose that Wilbur's rapid decline in mental state was not the work of pure and simple spite and bitterness, but instead the work of voices that he was finally vulnerable enough to listen to. Let's run through the timeline. November 16th, Wilbur is exiled, taking Tommy to what would eventually become the Revolution HQ and the new nation of Poctopia. Now, I don't think Revolution was ever off of the table. Wilbur wouldn't have sought out the help of Technoblade if he didn't intend to take the country back. However, the reason he wanted to go to war was initially to seize back power, as he believed himself to be the only one fit to protect his people. At some point down the line though, something whispered in his ear that maybe Lemanburg didn't need a ruler, and that governments as a whole might not be the way of the future. Something managed to get in his head and turn his steadfast belief in governments and desire for power into anarchistic tendencies and a desire to burn it all to the ground. And of course, as it regularly does with my channel, I believe the answer lies with Technoblade. You see, Technoblade has potentially the most well-defined example of canon chat interaction, and was actually the first character to include the narrative device into his own canon. His chat takes the form of anarchistic voices in his head, constantly demanding violence and destruction. They are so influential in his character arc that he has said on multiple occasions that his character actively struggles to fight against the wishes of his voices.
The voices in my head, Tommy. They tell me to kill.
Now, the character of Techno certainly has the mental willpower to at least withstand these voices for the most part. This is likely because of his prolonged exposure to said voices, learning how to cultivate a somewhat healthy relationship with them. However, Wilbur did not have such experience. Now, we already know that voices can come in a multitude of forms, with some even having physical presences in the Dream SMP canon, like the murder of crows mentioned earlier. Even more relevant to this theory, though, is Rambu's ender particles. It has been said that his ender particles are even present and aware of what happens during his end walk phases, but are unable to tell him what actually happens. Now, if this is true, then that means that it's possible for Rambu's chat to be present, without his acknowledgement or even consciousness. So now that we know that it's possible for the voices to interact with things outside of their creator's intentions, is it really impossible then to rule out that the voices in Technoblade's head are not voices at all, but rather their own sentient beings that are able to infiltrate certain hosts? And if they can get into the head of Technoblade, what's stopping them from getting into the head of Wilbur? My theory is this. Technoblade's voices act like a plague. They feast on those with vulnerable minds and violent tendencies, seeing them as their most promising candidates to inflict chaos on the world. These voices somehow got into the mind of Wilbur, and along with the influence of Techno's personal ideologies, gradually chipped away at Wilbur's principles and drove him closer and closer to the anarchistic rebel that they so craved to create. People do not simply go mad without some kind of maddening stimulus, and apart from the initial exile that Wilbur faced, he did not really have a stimulus to send him down such a dark path. Are we really expected to believe that Tommy, a literal child proven to be vulnerable to manipulation time and time again, had a greater mental fortitude than Wilbur and can withstand the circumstances they faced with greater effect? I personally doubt it. And therefore present to you my theory that Wilbur was affected by the very same voices that plague Technoblade to this day, and simply didn't tell anyone about them out of fear of looking crazy. But of course, this is all just a theory, and while I think I've made some pretty valid points, I am aware that this can all be explained away by any other means that the creators see fit. Make sure to leave a comment below with theories of your own, and before you go, I invite you to ponder the question. If this is all true, then could the voices have played a part in other important events in the Dream SMP? After all, this wasn't the only time Lemanburg was destroyed. Maybe the voices struck twice.